August 1944, East Prussia. At the Wehrmacht Command Center, General Alfred Jodl reviews reports from the Western Front with a slight smile of contempt. According to maps and logic, the Americans had gone too far, too fast. Patton was advancing at 30 miles a day, with 12 divisions consuming fuel, ammunition and rations at a rate never before recorded. For Jodl, it was only a matter of time before the breakthrough collapsed under his own weight. After all, no mechanized force can sustain such speed without an inevitable logistical collapse. But that quiet confidence ignored a detail that German calculations had not foreseen. As the tanks advanced, behind them was already moving a living, mobile, incessant infrastructure. Thousands of American trucks were already crossing France at an industrial pace, creating a supply line unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. That laughter, fueled by rigid doctrine and an absolute faith in physical restraints, was about to be silenced, not by tanks, not by bombings, but by a continuous stream of vehicles operating 24 hours a day, led by invisible men and tireless engines. That's the story of Red Ball Express, the operation that replaced collapse with abundance and made the German generals stop laughing. But before we dive into the maps, there's one statistic that defines this whole story. 412,000 tons, 82 days, 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers. While the German General Staff calculated the collapse of the Third Army, America turned the impossible into routine. The math of war said that an army couldn't advance faster than its supplies. And yet, American trucks were about to prove otherwise. Each number of this operation seemed like a provocation to logic, an affront to physics, a gasoline-powered miracle. And if you believe that military history is more than battles, that it is also the history of human ingenuity and how it changes the course of the world, support this channel. Leave the like and subscribe. This is what keeps alive the memory of those who won the war with engines and not just with weapons. General Alfred Jodl did not doubt the numbers. He only believed that the laws of physics were on the German side. For him, the war was an exact equation: weight, consumption, distance, fuel. No army could maintain an offensive more than 300 kilometers from the supply bases. It was an accepted axiom since Napoleon. When the American Third Army crossed France at absurd speed, German reports treated it as a miscalculation. "They will stop," the August 17, 1944 memo read. "No mechanized force can sustain 400 miles of advance without logistical disruption." This confidence was not empty arrogance. It was the reflection of a doctrine forged in the Blitzkrieg, where the secret lay in moving fast, winning before scarcity, and then reorganizing. But what the Germans called strategy was, for the Americans, only the beginning. On the other side of the channel, America had made logistics an industrial science. Each Sherman tank that advanced in France represented the tip of a supply chain that began in Detroit, crossed the Atlantic, and landed in Cherbourg. Each gallon of fuel burned at the front was replaced by 20, ready to be shipped. The US military didn't care about scarcity. It eliminated it by excess. While the Germans calculated how much they could save, the Americans measured how much they could spend. This philosophical difference, production versus containment, would shape the fate of both armies. For Hitler's generals, the American problem was the same one that had paralyzed them in Russia: distance and consumption. In 1941, the German advance towards Moscow was halted, not because of Soviet resistance, but because the fuel ran out. Trucks broke down on the dirt roads, horses died of exhaustion, and ammunition was piled up 300 kilometers from the front. This experience created a dogma within the General Staff. No advance exceeds the reach of supply. The Americans ignored the dogma and defeated it. When the troops landed in Normandy, American planning already foresaw the problem that the Germans considered insoluble. Ships carried not only tanks, but bridges, pipelines, mobile workshops, and thousands of 2.5-ton GMC CCKW standardized trucks. Each mass-produced with interchangeable parts, identical motors, and the ability to operate 20 hours a day. Germany manufactured vehicles with artisanal precision. The United States manufactured chaos in series, and the chaos worked. By 1944, American production of military trucks had already exceeded 500,000 units, 10 times more than the entire Wehrmacht motorized fleet. It is here that the narrator pauses and observes the statistical abyss. While the Germans counted horses, the Americans counted engines. If this data surprises you, comment, "Logistics wins." To the Germans, American industry seemed like fiction. They saw war as a duel between men and machines, but they did not understand that America had brought the two together. The American soldier was the extension of an assembly line. He fought with tools designed not to fail. Standardization turned improvisation into a method. Engines changed in 45 minutes, tires replaced in the field, discarded vehicles as if they were empty cartridges. No army in history had treated equipment so coldly and achieved such efficiency. The German soldier, trained to preserve each piece, watched in bewilderment as the Americans abandoned trucks that were still functional to move forward with new ones. For the German, it was waste. For the American, it was progress. In reports intercepted by Allied intelligence, German generals scoffed at this logic, calling it mechanical childishness. But what they called childishness was the infancy of a new military age. While German strategists drafted maneuvers, Americans redesigned the very infrastructure of the war. The Navy had created submarine pipelines, Operation Pluto, that transported fuel directly from England to France, something the Germans didn't even detect. The U.S. Air Force converted transport planes into flying trucks, and the Army created roads dedicated to the constant movement of supplies. The Red Ball Express was born in this environment of industrial abundance, as a response to what Germany considered impossible. The Germans expected the collapse of the Third Army within days. Instead, they saw the offensive accelerate. The historical irony is that the very doctrine of the Blitzkrieg, which preached continuous movement, would be defeated by an enemy who took it to the logistical extreme. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply, it multiplied the advance. It was a fuel and ammunition blitz, a high-speed logistics attack. By August 25th, Patton's divisions were 400 miles ahead of schedule and still receiving supplies with industrial punctuality. The German reaction was one of incredulity. General Walter Model recorded in a report, "They do not fight with men but with factories." Guderian, upon reading the reconnaissance reports, wrote, "No army could advance so far. Either the numbers are wrong or the war has changed." The war had changed. While the German General Staff scrambled to reorganize its lines, American convoys advanced in unbroken columns. Each truck followed another less than 5 minutes away. The discipline was industrial, not military. When a vehicle broke down, it was pushed to the side of the road and another took its place. It was war reduced to the efficiency of an assembly line. Germany, which had invented the Blitzkrieg, now watched helplessly as its mechanized version on a continental scale stood by. For the Americans, success was not in tactical genius, but in eliminating the unforeseen. Every ton of fuel delivered meant more miles of lead, and every mile traveled was an argument against German arrogance. The German generals believed they were fighting soldiers. In fact, they faced a system that united industries, engineers, and workers into a single global army. The Red Ball Express was the logistical face of this civilization on the move. On maps of German operations, supply lines were treated as vulnerabilities. In American plans, they became weapons. When the Third Army crossed the Seine, there was no longer any doubt. The collapse that the Germans predicted would never come. Still, they kept asking how it was possible, and the answer, though simple, was devastating. For Germany, the war was a matter of limitation. For America, of capacity. The difference between the two concepts would be the difference between advancement and surrender. And when the convoys began to be seen by German aviators, a new question arose among the officers: how to fight an enemy that turns the road itself into a weapon. That would be the question that would guide German despair next week, and the beginning of one of the greatest doctrinal humiliations in military history. In the minds of German generals, war was a mathematical art governed by discipline and calculation. Since 1939, the Blitzkrieg had proven to the world that German precision could move entire armies like cogs in a perfect machine. Every tank, every artillery piece, every infantry company advanced under a meticulously synchronized plan. In Prussia, the General Staff treated logistics as a science subordinated to strategy. Fuel followed the offensive, not determined it. This belief shaped contempt for Americans. To officers like von Rundstedt and Walter Model, the U.S. Army was a colossus without discipline, noisy, improvised, dependent on technology rather than doctrine. They saw a military force that relied too heavily on fragile machines, unable to hold together in protracted combat. The view was reinforced by reports from early 1944. In the first weeks after D-Day, convoys jammed on beaches, disorganized lines of trucks, officers inexperienced in continental logistics. In the eyes of the Wehrmacht, this was not an army, but a soulless industrial extension. The Americans, they said, knew how to produce but not sustain, and in war sustaining meant surviving. German doctrine did not see utility in volume, it saw weakness in it. German efficiency resided in containment, in the rational use of resources. Each advance was planned to last to the exact limit of supply. It was what they called the culmination, the moment when the offensive had to stop to resupply. This limitation was accepted as the natural law of mechanized warfare. But the United States was about to demonstrate that nature could be violated. German prejudice against American abundance had been going on for a long time. Since World War I, the Prussian military elite had considered the United States a commercial power, not a military one. In 1918, Ludendorff was already mocking the soldiers of the typewriter, stating that American culture depended more on factories than on courage. In 1944, this perception was still in force. Intelligence officials reported that the Americans were slow, bureaucratic, and overly reliant on supplies. "They fight with full stomachs," read a report from the 47th Panzer Corps. "Without their trucks, they don't walk. Without fuel, they don't fight." This belief fueled a technical arrogance that would become the war's greatest misjudgment, because while the Germans saw logistics as a problem, the Americans treated it as a purpose. The irony was that the Blitzkrieg, Germany's own invention, had been the harbinger of its failure. The lightning was not sustainable. In each campaign, the same pattern was repeated: rapid advance, breaking through enemy lines, then stagnation due to lack of fuel and parts. In Poland, success was quick because the distance was short. In France in 1940, the advance was sustained for 43 days before stalling due to shortages. In Russia in 1941, the collapse came within weeks. The fuel was not enough. The most motorized army in the world was in fact powered by horses, more than 600,000. The American General Staff studied these failures coldly. What the Germans called tactical genius, they called structural dependence. While Berlin invested in sophisticated tanks and detailed planning, Washington invested in roads, standardized engines, and redundancy. The American doctrine was based on a simple principle: if something breaks, replace it. German doctrine said, if something breaks, fix it. The result would be a logistical chasm. In 1944, Germany produced an average of 5,000 military vehicles per month. The United States, 50,000, a ratio of 10 to 1. The war had ceased to be a tank contest. It was a contest of aftermarket engines. Still, German generals maintained the conviction that quality trumped quantity. Guderian wrote in his notes that German technical superiority will compensate for any enemy excess. But this compensation never came. The complex and expensive Panther and Tiger tanks required constant maintenance and very high fuel consumption. Meanwhile, the American Sherman tank, simple, light, and cheap, advanced in hordes, supported by a replacement system that Germany could never match. German arrogance turned technical pride into strategic weakness. Model, inspecting the Western Front in August, told a subordinate, "The Americans are predictable. They do not attack without guaranteeing supply. That's where we'll get them, when we run out of gas." He did not know that on that same day, 6,000 trucks were already traveling the French roads towards the front. The Germans believed they were facing an adversary subject to the same laws that imprisoned them. That was the fatal irony, because unlike the Blitzkrieg, which was born from planning, the Red Ball Express would be born from improvisation. While Germany relied on predictability, America thrived on chaos. On the battlefield, this difference became visible. Allied planes flew over endless truck columns, and German reconnaissance reports described continuous, unspaced, no blackout traffic. For the Germanic mentality, it was logistical suicide. For the American, it was speed. What seemed like indiscipline was actually a new kind of order, an industrial order which needed no silence, only movement. The German General Staff did not realize that the enemy had turned the road itself into a production line. Each truck was a cog, each driver a worker cell in a machine that never slept. Clausewitz's doctrines, which treated supply as an appendage of strategy, became irrelevant in the face of a force that made logistics its own weapon. Germany believed it was fighting soldiers. I was fighting against a system. When reports began to mention that American units received supplies before requisitioning them, The generals simply laughed. They thought it was impossible, but they would soon realize that the impossibility was already underway. On August 25, 1944, the first Red Ball Express convoy officially departed from Cherbourg. From then on, every German prediction would become an error. And when the columns of trucks began to crisscross France with headlights on, defying blackout bombs and logic, observers of the Third Reich understood too late that they were not facing an army. They were facing a civilization that had industrialized war itself. And this revelation the next day would begin to change everything. German doctrine saw mechanized warfare as a symphony of precision, a cold calculation in which every cog had to work in absolute harmony. It was the direct inheritance of military Prussia, Clausewitz's thought, and engineering that fueled the Blitzkrieg. For the Wehrmacht General Staff, modern warfare was a matter of time and distance. Infantry broke through the lines, tanks exploited the gap, and before the enemy reacted, the victory was consolidated. But there was a hidden condition to this method. It relied on rails, horses, and limited fuel. The German war machine, despite its modern appearance, was mechanically fragile. In 1944, 80% of all Reich land transport still depended on animal traction. The Panzer and Tiger tanks, icons of invincibility, consumed absurd amounts of fuel and required spare parts that the German logistics system could never sustain. The Blitzkrieg worked while supplies lasted. When supplies ran out, the advance died with it. This limitation had already been exposed on 3 separate fronts, and on all of them, the generals blamed the weather, the terrain, or the enemy, when the real enemy was logistics. In Russia, Operation Barbarossa revealed the structural flaw of the model. In 1941, the German advance covered more than 600 kilometers in 3 months. Then he stopped. Soviet railways, with different gauges, made transportation impossible. The trucks broke down on the muddy and icy roads. Thousands of horses died. And the army that had taken Kiev and Smolensk ran out of fuel in front of Moscow. The same was true in North Africa, where Rommel, the Desert Fox, won brilliant victories until the supply ran out. Their tanks were better, their tactics superior, but the Italian supply ships were sunk and the armored columns were immobilized. In Italy in 1943, the problem was repeated. In all cases, the pattern was the same. Tactical genius stifled by logistical poverty. The German doctrine, built on the idea of movement, was hostage to mobility itself. They knew how to attack fast, but they didn't know how to sustain speed. So in observing Patton's advance in 1944, German generals saw a repetition of themselves. They go too far, von Rundstedt said in a report. The fuel will run out. Speed will become weakness. It was the projection of a trauma. They believed that the physics of war was universal, that no army could escape the tyranny of resupply. But on the other side of the Atlantic, an industrial civilization had created a new physics, the physics of infinite production. The United States did not think of a culmination. They thought of continuous replacement. While the Germans calculated how many trucks they could save, the Americans manufactured 10,000 more. War, for Berlin, was a problem of tactical engineering. For Washington, it was a question of capacity. This conceptual difference was invisible on the map, but deadly in the field. When Patton advanced 400 miles from Normandy, the German High Command believed that history would repeat itself. They had learned at Stalingrad that advancement self-destructs when fuel doesn't keep up. But the Third Army did not stop. He continued to cross destroyed rivers, villages, and bridges, while the Reich's calculations became obsolete. German intelligence reports measure American consumption with scientific precision. A Sherman tank burned half a gallon per mile. An armored division needed 1,000 tons daily. The reasoning was simple. 400 miles offshore, Patton's army would require more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Mathematically impossible, General Siegfried Westphal noted on August 20th. Even if they have unlimited trucks, which they don't have, the destroyed roads won't allow continuous traffic. It was a logical, coherent diagnosis, but completely wrong. The error was not in the numbers, but in the paradigm. The Germans still believed that logistics were the servant of tactics. The Americans had reversed the relationship. Logistics was the tactic. Every road, every bridge, and every truck was treated like a weapon. The fuel didn't just move the tanks, it determined where the war would take place. This understanding altered the essence of combat. And while the Reich still centralized its decisions in Berlin, the American command delegated total autonomy to transport officers who who acted with entrepreneurial speed. The result was the emergence of a phenomenon that German doctrine had never foreseen: unlimited advancement. In intercepted reports after the war, the Germans admitted that they did not understand how American forces managed to keep pace. An observer from the 21st Panzer Division wrote, "The enemy seems to move without dependence on bases. It creates new supply lines every day." That was exactly it. Americans didn't expect the lines to exist. They built them in motion. The industrial power of the United States had transformed the concept of logistics into something organic, mobile, adaptable. While the Germans traced fixed, protected routes, the Americans improvised paths through the destruction. Each bombed road became a new road, every ruin a deposit. German rigidity, which once symbolized efficiency, now represented vulnerability. American flexibility was controlled chaos, and chaos was advancing. German technical arrogance, shaped by the belief that war was an exercise in precision, could not bear the weight of improvisation. General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, upon receiving the reports from the Western Front in August, reportedly said, "The Americans are violating the laws of mechanized warfare. They shouldn't be moving so fast." The answer would come weeks later, on the banks of the Seine, when the impossible would become visible. What the Germans called lawlessness was actually the creation of a new doctrine, that of total industrial war. And the proof of this doctrine was about to appear on the French roads, illuminated by thousands of headlights that never went out. In the last days of August 1944, the German High Command believed it was about to witness the collapse of the American Third Army. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations, recorded in his diary, "Patton has gone too far. Within 48 hours, their offensive will cease. No army in history has violated the laws of supply." The prediction seemed logical. The Third Army had traveled 400 miles from Normandy, consuming fuel in proportions that even American calculations could not predict. But contrary to all expectations, the collapse did not come. Instead, Patton's tanks continued to move, fast, steady, relentless. What the Germans did not know was that, on the back roads and in the makeshift camps of France, a secret operation was already sustaining that advance. Thousands of trucks raced night and day, forming an invisible logistical artery. It did not yet have an official name, but it would soon be called Red Ball Express. The armored columns that seemed to disobey the laws of physics were actually powered by motion engineering that the Germans couldn't even imagine. On August 21st, the 47th Panzer Corps sent an intelligence report to Berlin. "The Americans are advancing 40 miles a day with no sign of breaking. Our forces do not understand how they maintain this pace." The tone was one of bewilderment, not admiration. German doctrine taught that every offensive had a natural limit, the point at which fuel and ammunition consumption exceeds refueling capacity. Patton had passed that point 3 days earlier and was still accelerating. The irony of this story is that the solution was before them. America had decided to eliminate the culmination by replacing it with absolute excess. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and want to support the creation of this type of in-depth content, like and subscribe. It helps keep the story behind the numbers alive. The American advance was not only rapid, it was irrational by the standards of the time. Patton's divisions crossed destroyed bridges, receiving fuel in the middle of the roads, refueling while still firing. Modern warfare, the Germans believed, was made up of pauses and resumptions. But for Americans, it was a continuous line of movement. What the Third Reich called an operational error was actually the first hint of a new kind of warfare: uninterrupted industrial warfare. At Chartres, a town that the German command considered safe for at least 2 weeks, American tanks arrived in 3 days. At Orléans, the 5th Panzer Army retreated without understanding how the enemy had traversed 200 miles of destroyed terrain without stopping to refuel. Field reports described the incessant sound of engines on the horizon, day and night, a metallic hum that moved forward without logic. Colonel Hans Speidel, von Rundstedt's chief of operations, recorded, "The enemy does not obey logistical timing. It seems to generate fuel out of nowhere." It wasn't magic, it was planning. While the Germans were doing calculations, the Americans were moving trucks. American doctrine ignored refinement and bet on volume. It didn't matter if 30% of the vehicles broke down, the remaining 70% would be enough. And every day new trucks arrived from England, replacing the lost ones. The system worked because it accepted loss as part of the equation. In contrast, Germany continued to treat every vehicle as irreplaceable, every liter of fuel as sacred. This cultural difference shaped the battlefield. The American advance was brutal, redundant, and effective. General Jodl in Wolfschanze studied the maps with increasing discomfort. "They're violating math," he told an aide. "No army moves at 60 kilometers a day and remains supplied." The answer came in silence, a silence cut only by the distant echo of the engines. The Red Ball Express, still without the name that would make it legendary, already operated with more than 5,000 trucks, each one carrying an average of 5 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations. Germany, accustomed to war by rail, did not understand that mobility. Its supply lines depended on rails and schedules. The American depended on roaders and improvisation. The difference seemed subtle, but it would be fatal. By the end of August, Patton had already reached the Seine. The 48-hour collapse forecast was a week old, and the advance continued. German radio intercepts revealed bewilderment. Officers reported enemy columns advancing at night, with headlights on without any concern for air attacks. To them, it was foolishness. For Americans, it was efficiency. The blackout was a luxury, speed, a necessity. The trains moved without pause, turning the night into the road. Field Marshal Walter Model, upon receiving new reports, wrote only 2 words: "We do not understand." This misunderstanding marked the turning point. The U.S. military had ceased to be just an invading force and had become a force in perpetual motion, a logistical organism that ignored the concept of pause. When Paris was liberated on August 25th, the Germans still hoped that the advance would cease. But on the roads to the west, something much bigger was being built, and in the days to come, the trucks that sustained the impossible would be given a name that would forever change the history of modern warfare. The logistical collapse the Germans had hoped for finally happened, but not among Patton's ranks. It emerged in the American supply system itself. By the end of August 1944, the railway lines were still destroyed, the ports were operating above capacity, and the supply depots in Cherbourg were overflowing. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food were piling up without enough transportation to reach the front lines. The world's most motorized army was on the verge of being immobilized, not by scarcity but by abundance. In the rear barracks, officers and transport engineers began to admit the obvious. Traditional methods had failed. American logistics, so efficient on paper, could not keep up with the advancement it had created. General John C.H. Lee, commander of communications for the European theater, assembled his principal officers at the Castle of Valognes. Among them were Lieutenant Colonel Lorin Ayers of the Motor Transport Service and Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, in charge of the Forward Communications Zone. The diagnosis was straightforward. The railroad system was collapsed, and Patton's divisions were consuming fuel faster than any calculations predicted. "Gentlemen," Ayers said, "if we continue to follow the playbook, Patton for tomorrow." The silence in the room was broken by a proposal as radical as it was simple: to create a living one-way military highway, operating day and night, supplying the front from the beaches. No bureaucracy, no pause, no blackout. A line of trucks that would never stop moving. It was such an insane idea that it ran counter to every logistical principle learned at West Point. The Germans, masters of the discipline of concealment, would have considered suicide. But the U.S. military had no choice. Thrasher approved the plan within minutes. The operation was given a name that came from railroad jargon: Red Ball, a term used for priority cargo that could not be delayed by anything. In 36 hours, the theory became reality. Officers began painting large red circles on road signs, signaling the convoy's exclusive route. 2 parallel routes were defined, one for loaded trucks heading east, the other for empty vehicles returning. The system was simple, brutal, and efficient. Each convoy would have absolute priority. No civilian, military, or service vehicles could use the route without authorization. From August 25, 1944, the roads of Normandy became a pulsating line of steel, rubber, and noise. At 2 in the morning, the first convoys began to move, headlights on, ignoring blackout discipline. It was a military heresy, but an industrial necessity. The Red Ball Express was born. Each truck would operate 20 hours a day, carrying between 5 and 7 tons of supplies. The 350-mile round trip was covered in just over 16 hours. Maintenance officers have established posts every 50 miles, ready to repair any mechanical failure in less than 15 minutes. If the truck could not be repaired, it was pushed to the side of the road and another took its place. Efficiency came not from precision, but from volume. When the first estimates reached the General Staff, the numbers seemed impossible. 12,500 tons of supplies per day, 6,000 trucks operating simultaneously, 140 transport companies. No logistics manual had foreseen such a scale, but the force of American improvisation proved that the impossible could be industrialized. Chaos became a method. Every 5 minutes, a new train left Cherbourg. Every 24 hours, more than 5,000 vehicles completed the round-trip cycle. The roads vibrated like horizontal assembly lines, with men, machines, and fuel flowing like a continuous river. The noise of the engines could be heard tens of miles away, and the reflection of the headlights at night created a line of light that cut through occupied France. To the Germans, who still believed in blackouts and secrecy, this was madness. For Americans, it was victory moving. The Red Ball Express was an operation that defied everything: doctrine, hierarchy, prudence. The fuel that fed Patton's tanks was hauled by exhausted drivers, asleep at the wheel, driving trucks that had become the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. In just 1 week, the Red Ball delivered 89,939 tons of supplies, more than any army had transported overland in all history. The system began to gain its own culture. Drivers decorated their vehicles with nicknames and slogans: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, here we go. Military discipline gave way to the logic of production. What mattered wasn't the form, it was the result. American doctrine had bowed to necessity, and necessity had created a new kind of strategy, the strategy of the permanent movement. The Red Ball Express was not planned in conferences or diagrams. It was born out of urgency and the ability to improvise. And it was this boldness, this contempt for the rules, that turned a crisis into an advantage. When the first news of the success reached Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander summed it up in one sentence: they made the impossible work. By that time, the Red Ball Express had already become the backbone of the Allied offensive. Patton was advancing 60 kilometers a day, supported by a system that the Germans still believed to be a logistical impossibility. And as the Reich struggled to understand how Americans kept pace, something even more unlikely was about to surprise them. Who exactly was driving those trucks? They did not appear in headlines, nor in official photographs. They were not movie heroes, nor did they command tanks. But without them, the American advance would have stopped before the Seine. There were 23,000 men, mostly young African Americans, segregated within the very army they swore to serve. Forbidden to fight in many combat units, forbidden to attend the same mess halls and barracks as the whites, they were sent to the less prestigious functions: transportation. In the military hierarchy, driving trucks was a secondary task, but in the reality of modern warfare it was vital. These men were the pulse of the Red Ball Express, the invisible army that kept Patton's blitz alive. Hailing from Alabama, Texas, Carolina, and Chicago, they weren't trained engineers or decorated soldiers. They were truck drivers, farmers, mechanics, bus drivers. Many had never left their hometowns. Now they were traversing France in endless columns, carrying 5 tons of fuel and ammunition on each trip. The routes were dangerous, the attacks constant, the absolute fatigue, but they drove non-stop. Every 15 minutes, a truck would leave. Every 15 minutes, another one arrived. And amid the roar of the engines, these soldiers proved that courage has no color. Each convoy was a living contradiction. Black men hauling fuel to tanks commanded by white officers who, upon returning home, would still live in a segregated country. The historical irony was brutal. American democracy being sustained by citizens who could not vote in most states. But in that war, duty spoke louder. They drove at night with headlights on, knowing that this made them easy targets for planes and snipers. They made dangerous turns on roads with no shoulders, guided only by the glare of the trucks ahead. Many died in accidents, ambushes, or simply from exhaustion. There was no glory, no medals, no speeches, only the duty and the movement. The trucks on the Red Ball Express have become a metaphor for America itself, loud, uneven, but unstoppable. On the bumpers, hand-painted phrases revealed the spirit of those drivers. Hitler, here comes the Red Ball. Nothing for the wind, neither do we. Some carried family photos pasted on the dashboard. Others placed improvised radios, transforming the roar of the engine into a soundtrack of resistance. It was the opposite of the Germanic image of war, without uniformity, without symmetry, without aesthetic discipline, but it was effective and profoundly human. By September 1944, More than 75% of Red Bull drivers were African American. Many worked 48-hour shifts without rest, sleeping inside the vehicles with the engine running so as not to waste time in the resumption. Others took turns driving on roads destroyed by shelling, where every turn could hide a mine or an attack. Still, the trains continued. Patton, in a letter to the command, described these men as the Hercules pillars of modern warfare. He knew that without them his tanks would stop, but few of these drivers knew the words of praise. For them, recognition would come decades later, when historians discovered that 412,000 tons of supplies were delivered thanks to the Red Ball Express, and that without this operation the Allied advance would have stalled. The final irony is that the same soldiers who drove trucks through a liberated Europe would return to a country that did not yet consider them equal. But on the battlefield, they proved something that neither Nazi ideology nor American prejudice could deny. That moral force can move the impossible. To the Germans, who believed in racial purity and military discipline, the sight of those convoys was incomprehensible. Intelligence reports describe chaotic columns made up of black soldiers with no visible hierarchy, but with unusual efficiency. The phrase reveals the blindness of enemy doctrine. They confused spontaneity with disorder and diversity with weakness. In practice, what they saw was the opposite, an organic force, united by purpose, where each driver was an essential link. Chaos was organization in disguise, and in the constant noise of engines, there was a message that crossed borders and ideologies. American power was not just in the factories, but in the people who kept those factories moving. The Red Ball Express was not just a military operation, it was a moral response, a proof that democracy, however imperfect, could sustain itself in a kind of force that tyranny would never comprehend, that of the ordinary individual doing what needs to be done. When General Eisenhower visited one of the checkpoints in September 1944, he was silent before the scene. Hundreds of trucks, endless columns, drivers soiled with oil and dust, operating with industrial precision. If we lost that, we would lose the war, he said. And he was right. The Red Ball Express didn't just keep Patton moving forward, it kept the very idea of American movement alive. The enemy laughed at the disorder, but did not realize that this chaos had rhythm, a rhythm that echoed into the night, like the metallic sound of victory approaching. And the day the Reich finally understood who was behind those engines, war ceased to be a matter of pride and became a matter of survival. To the German General Staff, what the Americans were doing on the roads of France was a direct violation of the laws of war. Intercepted reports described something that sounded more like insanity than strategy. Convoys running day and night with their headlights on, columns of hundreds of trucks with no spacing, broken-down vehicles pushed to the side of the road instead of repaired, and a completely non-existent camouflage discipline. German doctrine was clear. At night, absolute blackout was mandatory. Any light meant certain death. But the Red Ball Express ignored all this. French roads became continuous rivers of light, bright lines that cut through the darkness and denounced at every turn the American contempt for tactical conventions. Colonel Hans Speidel wrote in his September report, "The enemy does not hide, does not disperse, does not follow the rules of military science, and yet it suffers no punishment." To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. What seemed like chaos was actually industrial efficiency in disguise. The secret of the Red Ball Express was not to avoid error, it was to accept it en masse. The Americans assumed 30% of daily mechanical failures as part of the calculation, and yet the system continued to work. The doctrine of redundancy replaced that of perfection. It was the triumph of volume over refinement. When Luftwaffe observers began to report the constant movement of vehicles, the estimates sounded delirious. About 1,000 trucks an hour, visible for more than 20 kilometers. No spacing, no blackout. The German command dismissed the reports as observation errors, until the panzer divisions began to feel the direct effects. The American columns, fueled by this reason-defying system, advanced faster than the Germans could retreat. In the same period, an internal Wehrmacht calculation estimated that the Americans burned 300,000 gallons of fuel a day just to keep their convoys running. This amount alone exceeded the total fuel that many German armies received for all fronts combined. And here's the fact they never admitted aloud. American gasoline production in 1944 was 10 times greater than the entire Axis capacity combined. If this surprises you, leave it in the comments. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what happened. The war was no longer won on the battlefield, but decided on the ability to keep engines running. To Field Marshal Walter Model, who studied every detail of Allied operations, the Red Ball Express seemed like an impossible logistical nightmare. He noted in one of his confidential reports, "They violate all the rules, waste fuel, expose themselves to aviation, and yet they are not punished. We are facing not an army, but a civilization that does not fear the cost." That was the phrase that summed up the fundamental difference between the two sides. Germany saw the war as an equation of limited resources. Every liter, every truck, every piece counted. The United States saw it as a problem of continuous flux. What was lost was simply replaced. This mental difference created a strategic chasm. While the Germans tried to understand American logic, the convoys had already become unstoppable. The American chaos was not the absence of method, it was a new form of order. The roads, filled with endless lines of trucks, resembled moving assembly lines, where each driver was a cog in a gigantic machine. Maintenance was improvised but efficient. Damaged trucks were cannibalized by parts, engines replaced on the side of the road, tires recycled in the rain. There were no contingency plans. There was immediate action. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, upon receiving reports about this organized anarchy, is reported to have said, "They are turning chaos into tactics. This is not war, it's production in motion." And he was right. The Red Ball Express did not follow military discipline. It followed industrial logic. Instead of eliminating flaws, he absorbed them. Instead of hiding his operations, he showed them off. Instead of retreating in the face of risk, he accelerated. The Germans, trained to see war as a precision equation, could not comprehend that the Americans' new weapon was abundance itself. When the US military abandoned prudence, Germany lost control of time and with it, war. Patton's advance was no longer an offensive, it was a continuous production line. And as the Germans struggled to predict its collapse, something even more disturbing began to emerge. Every American truck was replaced faster than they could destroy it. In 1 week, the Red Ball Express lost 500 vehicles. In the same period, 700 new ones arrived from England. For the Reich, this math was impossible. For the United States, it was only Tuesday. This was the real violation of the German military code. The war had become a matter of scale, not strategy. And on the scale, they were doomed. When the Wehrmacht reports reached Berlin, an operations officer wrote in despair, "They cannot be detained. They are not afraid of loss." And while German generals tried to decipher the secret, the Red Ball Express continued its course, lighting up the night, roaring like a mobile factory, defying European military dogma with every mile it traveled. But what the Germans didn't yet know was that American power didn't just come from production, it also came from the ability to innovate about movement. And the next innovation would transform the very way of transporting fuel and ammunition in the middle of war. The numbers began to circulate through German intelligence channels as if they were absurd rumors, American propaganda designed to inflate morale. Intercepted reports mentioned 12,500 tons of supplies delivered per day, 6,000 trucks operating without pause, and 23,000 drivers taking turns in near superhuman shifts. The Berlin General Staff classified the data as impossible. Field Marshal Walter Model, upon reading the first full report, reportedly said, "No land logistical system could sustain this. Physics doesn't allow it." But physics at that time was American. Red Ball Express had turned theoretical numbers into operational reality. The daily transport average, calculated between August 25 and 31, 1944, was 12,848 tons. In the same period, 89,939 tons had been moved, a figure that exceeded the total motorized transport capacity of the entire German army on the Western Front. The operation's own consumption was also an unheard-of war statistic, 300,000 gallons of fuel a day just to power the convoys themselves. The system itself devoured energy on an industrial scale, but it returned efficiency on a scale never seen before. The complete round-trip cycle was 686 miles, covered on average in 16.5 hours. Each truck made 1.5 trips a day. The mathematics that for German doctrine meant collapse became, for Americans, a rhythm. The laws of scarcity had been replaced by the laws of abundance. German spreadsheets designed to predict the breaking point of a mechanized force could not even model this phenomenon. Redundancy, seen by the Germans as waste, was the new form of efficiency. For every truck damaged, another was already en route. For every tire worn, two waited in mobile depots set up every 25 miles. The American maintenance doctrine also defied German logic. Where the Reich repaired engines, the United States replaced them. Where the Reich saved parts, the United States discarded entire vehicles. In just 82 days of operation, the Red Ball Express consumed 180,000 tires and destroyed 5,000 trucks. But the operation never stopped. Industrial production compensated for each loss with a new delivery. While Germany planned months to replace a wrecked truck, French ports received weekly ships loaded with hundreds of new vehicles. Efficiency was not in accuracy, but in scale. German air reconnaissance reports showed something that German doctrine could not accept: fuel and ammunition depots popping up every 25 miles, like a living refueling network. German intelligence calculated that the American fuel depots in France alone were larger than all the strategic reserves of the Reich combined. This realization forced an uncomfortable silence in the Berlin offices. Clausewitz and Moltke's manuals did not foresee that industry could replace strategy. General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, revised the estimates and refused to believe it. No mechanized force can advance 60 miles a day for weeks at a time. It's propaganda. But Allied radio broadcasted in the open Patton's confirmed positions, irrefutable proof that the impossible was happening. The American divisions, supplied by this never-ending supply system, were advancing twice as fast as the theoretical mobility calculation of a panzer division. Each new statistic dismantled a German conviction. When Wehrmacht logistics analysts compared the numbers, they found something even more disturbing. The U.S. Army burned more fuel in a single day of operation than the Luftwaffe received for an entire month of missions. And even so, he never stopped. The laws of war had been reversed. The enemy that should have been exhausted became faster, more aggressive, and more supplied the farther it advanced. Marshal von Rundstedt wrote in a tone of resignation, "They industrialized the war in a way that we do not understand. It's the assembly line applied to the battlefield." Germany, which had invented the Blitzkrieg, watched helplessly as its own doctrine was superseded in its own conceptual territory. The Red Ball Express had done what the Blitzkrieg never could: sustain speed without collapsing. German mobile warfare relied on railroads and horses, the American company of engines and fuel. What was fragility had become strength. What was waste had become a method. The final report of the Abwehr, compiled in September, attempted to rationalize the logistical defeat. The enemy does not win by skill, but by quantity. Its doctrine is excess. The editor probably did not realize that in writing this he was acknowledging the birth of a new military science. Excess had become a strategy, the numbers, a weapon, and while the German generals tried to adjust their maps for a war they no longer understood, the Red Ball Express accelerated. In just 3 weeks, it delivered more than 250,000 tons of supplies, the equivalent of 12 freight trains per hour, 24 hours a day, for 20 consecutive days. No European railway had achieved such a performance. No military manual had provided for this scale. And when the last convoy of that month crossed Belgium's borders, bringing fuel for the September offensives, a report intercepted by the Allied command revealed the enemy's psychological breakdown. A German officer, interrogated after the capture, summed up the impotence with one sentence: "They have more trucks than we have soldiers." And he wasn't exaggerating. The United States alone had produced more than 2.4 million trucks during the war. The whole of Germany produced just over 350,000. The statistic that seemed like a curiosity turned into a prophecy. The Reich had been defeated even before the first convoy stopped. And as the sound of engines echoed off the roads of France, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. Supplying the armies now crossing German borders would require something even greater, even more unlikely: air logistics that would redefine the very concept of war supply. War for Germany had always been a matter of virtue. Discipline, courage, maneuver, almost spiritual values shaped the way the army viewed itself. For Americans, it was a matter of production. The Germanic ideal of individual excellence, the perfect soldier trained to act with surgical precision, now faced the empire of standardization, where strength came not from a hero, but from an assembly line. And this philosophical, almost moral difference would define the outcome of the war. While the Krupp and Daimler factories produced sophisticatedly engineered vehicles, but in limited numbers, General Motors and Dodge mass-produced trucks, simple, robust, replaceable. The CCKW 21-2-ton model, known to drivers as Deuce and a Half, was the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Weighing almost 3 tons empty, capable of carrying 5 and, in emergencies, up to 7, it was more than a truck. It was a concept. With 4-wheel drive, an automatic inflation system, and an engine that ran on any type of fuel, the CCKW symbolized American philosophy: durability over elegance, quantity over refinement. By the end of the war, the United States had produced more than 500,000 units of this vehicle, more than the total number of trucks of all the Axis armies combined. Germany designed vehicles to last for years. The United States designed vehicles to last long enough. Each CCKW was a disposable cell of a larger organism, the logistics system. The American soldier did not need to preserve his truck. If it broke, it was abandoned, cannibalized by parts, unceremoniously replaced. Efficiency came from the acceptance of wear. This philosophy shocked the Germans, who were accustomed to an almost religious cult of maintenance. On the Red Ball Express, engines were changed in 45 minutes, often on the side of the road. A damaged truck was no problem. It was just a predicted variable. The teams of mechanics operated as mobile surgical units. Every 50 miles there was a repair station. Almost 1,800 daily repairs were carried out, without interrupting the flow. The system was brutal, impersonal, and efficient, and the Germans interpreted it as carelessness. But it was calculation. Waste was the price of continuity. General Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of Africa and panzer commander in France, wrote after the war, "They fight as they manufacture. What they lose in accuracy they gain in volume. We destroyed 10 trucks, 20 appeared. We destroyed 20, 50 appear. It's like fighting a factory." The phrase was literal. The Red Ball Express was General Motors on the move, Ford on wheels, American industry translated into action. German military doctrine believed that a soldier's worth lay in obedience and technique. The American was beginning to prove that the value of a soldier could lie in the ability to improvise and in the access to infinite resources. Decentralized maintenance, the autonomy of the sergeants, and the pragmatism of the drivers created an organic network that adjusted itself. Germany operated rigid hierarchies, the United States, adaptive systems, and this contrast was devastating. For the Reich, the material was a support for morals. For America, the material was morality itself. American faith was in production, in the certainty that the assembly line would never stop. It was an almost religious conviction in the strength of industry as an expression of freedom. While the Germans worshipped the warrior, the Americans worshipped the engineer. While one exalted honor in sacrifice, the other celebrated victory in efficiency. Blitzkrieg was born of human talent. Red Ball Express was born from machines, and it was the second that survived. The strength of the United States lay in its ability to turn war into an extension of its economy. The same system that produced civilian cars now supplied armies. The same workman who assembled an engine in Detroit now fed Patton's gear. It was mechanized democracy, chaotic, noisy, but unstoppable. On the battlefield, American industry had become a moral force. Each truck sent was a declaration. The whole country fought together. When the Wehrmacht intercepted reports on the scale of American production, the numbers seemed absurd. While Germany manufactured 20,000 vehicles a year, the United States produced 600,000. This asymmetry was not just technical, it was spiritual. The Reich believed that it would win by the superiority of its culture. America demonstrated that it would win by the superiority of its system. The German soldier marched with glory. The American drove with purpose. Victory had ceased to be an abstract ideal. It was a matter of supply. Every ton delivered, every truck replaced, every engine changed was an affirmation of faith in one's own ability to create. And that faith, fueled by the pace of the factories, was engulfing Europe. Marshal von Rundstedt, studying the statistics of General Motors and Ford, reportedly said, "They build more trucks than we have bullets. You can't defeat that with courage." It was the bitterest confession of the German military elite that modern warfare had changed its language. There was no longer talk of bravery but of logistics, not in honor, but in tonnage. Virtue had been replaced by speed. And as American trucks continued to cruise French roads, the Reich began to realize that it was no longer fighting an army, but a concept, a civilization that had transformed production into strategy and efficiency into moral. But Germany still believed it could react. In the fall of 1944, his engineers would try to create an answer, a rushed copy of the Red Ball Express, and the result would be one of the most humiliating attempts at imitation in military history. The nights of the Western Front became different from September 1944 onwards, where the tense silence of the trenches once reigned. A constant, monotonous, deafening sound began to echo, the non-stop roar of American engines. The noise did not cease. Day and night, a metallic stream crossed the roads of France. To the exhausted German soldiers, the sound was more than noise. It was a living reminder of what they didn't have: movement. The columns of the Red Ball Express did not hide. Their six-cylinder engines roared through the hills and valleys as a permanent warning that the war was lost, even before the bullets confirmed it. Troops stationed near the supply routes began to report a new, suffocating sensation. They were not bombings. It was the sound of the enemy that did not stop. The 116th Panzer Division sent a field report on August 30th describing columns of trucks visible to the naked eye for 20 kilometers, with headlights on and continuous noise, like that of an army that never sleeps. For the Germans, the war had always been a symphony of speed and silence. The thunder of the Panzer followed by the strategic silence of the pause. Now they faced an enemy who had turned noise into doctrine. The sound of American trucks became the anthem of abundance. Each roar of the engine carried a message. The United States could sustain whatever it wanted, for as long as it wanted. For the German soldiers, that incessant noise was not just physical, it was psychological. A captured account from a Wehrmacht officer in northern France describes the phenomenon as der Motorenfluch, the curse of engines. They don't stop. Even when we sleep, we listen. Even when we retreat, we feel it. Trucks are everywhere. As the weeks passed, reports of ghost trains began. German troops isolated in woods and villages claimed to hear American engines even when there were no convoys nearby. The sound had become a collective hallucination. An infantry corporal reported ordering his men to open fire on an empty road, convinced that trucks were approaching. Nothing came, only the echo of the shots themselves. The German mind, conditioned to win by discipline, began to yield to the sound of organized chaos. The invisible war was winning. Field Marshal Model recorded in his diary in early September, "They are everywhere. Even when they are not, we still hear them. The Americans won the noise war." It was a rare recognition. The enemy was imposing its presence not only through physical space, but through the sound domain. Each truck that passed created a wave of psychological impact that traveled along the front. The Reich, which had once terrified the world with the sound of its Panzer engines, now lived in terror by the sound of American engines. Noise has become a symbol of abundance and inevitability. In French villages, the sound of the Red Ball Express was hailed as a sign of liberation. For the German occupiers, it was the harbinger of the end. The local population began to associate that noise with security, food, cigarettes, and the end of the occupation. The symbolic power of the engines was so strong that the Allied command began to exploit it deliberately. American psychological warfare units began using convoy recordings to confuse and demoralize the enemy. When the Red Ball Express could not operate because of the weather, loudspeakers were positioned close to enemy lines, playing the sound of the engines throughout the night. The result was immediate. German troops began to report invisible columns advancing. Reich engineers, studying the phenomenon after the war, came to the conclusion that the Red Ball Express had created the first modern example of sound warfare, a weapon that does not kill, but exhausts. German doctrine, based on efficiency and control, had no antidote to the sound of organized disorder. Abundance produced noise, the noise, despair. In the last weeks of September, the Western Front turned into an auditory field. Americans dominated sound, and sound dominated the German mind. A report from the 5th Panzer Division noted, "We no longer hear the silence, there are always engines. Even when there isn't, we listen to them." The Red Ball Express had become more than a supply operation. It was a ghostly presence. Modern warfare, for the first time, had proved that sound could also be a weapon of destruction. The constant noise of American trucks served as a reminder that industrial warfare no longer needed heroism. All it took was rhythm. The Reich, which had so exalted strategic silence, had been defeated by an enemy who spoke through engines. When the prisoners began to be captured, many confessed that the noise of the roads had demoralized them more than any bombing. "They have infinite fuel," said a lieutenant captured on the outskirts of Chartres. "Every engine we hear is another nail in the Reich's coffin." It was an accurate metaphor. The trucks were steel hammers slamming into the moral fabric of the Wehrmacht. And when the Americans realized this effect, sound became part of the strategy. It was no longer just transportation, it was presence, it was psychology, it was dominance. The sound of trucks came to represent the very concept of total war, an enemy that could not be stopped because it could not be silenced. And it was just as the noise reached its peak that a new American innovation was about to extend the impossible even further, a supply line that would run through not just France, but the ocean itself. German mechanized warfare, celebrated as the pinnacle of military modernity, hid an uncomfortable truth. In 1944, most of the Reich army was still powered by horses. The myth of the Blitzkrieg, that image of tank columns crossing Europe, masked a medieval dependency. 4 out of 5 German divisions on the Western Front relied on animal traction to transport ammunition, fuel, and food. There were more than 1.1 million horses in service, carrying a 20th century war with 19th century technology. The difference was more than technical, it was philosophical. The Germans believed that tactical genius and discipline outweighed any material limitations. Americans believed the opposite, that the machine could compensate for any human error. And it was exactly this faith in the engine that destroyed German doctrine. While the Reich struggled to feed its animals and manufacture tanks, the United States burned 700,000 gallons of gasoline a day just to keep its convoys running. It was such an absurd amount that Germany itself could not produce it even in a month of full operation. The Red Ball Express alone consumed more fuel than the entire Luftwaffe in a few weeks in 1944. This number, for the German General Staff, was pure fiction. No economy could sustain such waste. But the American economy did not obey the laws of European scarcity. It rewrote them. In Detroit, a new assembly line produced a truck every 5 minutes. By comparison, it took a German factory the same amount of time to complete a single Panzer engine. The Blitzkrieg, once a symbol of efficiency, had become an anachronism. The Reich still thought of divisions, columns, and formations. The United States thought about flow, capacity, and replacement. An American truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a unit of time. Every minute of operation was worth fuel, mobility, and advancement, and each stopped truck was replaced by another, without hesitation. When the Germans tried to calculate the scale of the American operation, the math sounded offensive. The September 1944 report sent to the OKW estimated that the Allies possessed more than 400,000 trucks operating simultaneously in Europe. The German command classified the number as absurd. But he was wrong. The real number exceeded 500,000. If this surprises you, comment below absolute power, because that was exactly the message that the roar of the engines conveyed. War was now a matter of quantity. Every liter burned was a moral affirmation. We can spend more than you can produce. The German generals, trained in academies that exalted tactical reasoning, were faced with a war that was no longer won by the mind, but by the machine. German genius found the physical limit of industrial reality. While the columns of the Red Ball Express crossed 400 miles a day, the Reich supply convoys advanced less than 40. Destroyed roads, dead horses, shortages of horseshoes and rations turned the German army into a shadow of itself. The doctrine of the Blitzkrieg depended on surprise, but surprise now came from the Americans. No German maps could predict the Allied advance, because none of them understood the scale of the engine. Fuel had become the new artillery, and the truck the new soldier. Historian Karl-Heinz Frieser, decades later, summed up the paradox. The Blitzkrieg died by speeding. Red Ball Express was born to sustain the impossible. German superiority, built on a belief in technical excellence, was defeated by a philosophy of mass production that didn't have to be perfect, just constant. For every meticulously manufactured Panzer tank, the Americans produced 50 trucks. For every German piece fitted by hand, the Americans sent 10 spares. The Reich fought for durability, the United States for the replacement. The war had turned into a resupply competition, and the Germans were stuck in a paradigm that no longer made sense. Colonel Siegfried Westphal described the frustration in a letter after the war. The Americans did not fight as we did. They didn't bother to preserve. For them, the material was disposable. For us, it was sacred. And that made them invincible. It was a confession of philosophical defeat. The culture that saw attrition as failure was overcome by a culture that saw it as progress. The Red Ball Express embodied this new ethic. Victory belonged to those who could keep moving, not those who fought perfectly. Every truck that crossed the roads of Normandy proved that modern warfare no longer prized brilliance, it prized volume. The Germans, with their precision engineers, were overwhelmed by improvisation on an industrial scale. When the Americans began to convert their trucks into mobile workshops, refueling tanks still in motion, the Reich realized that it was facing something beyond tactics. It was a civilizational transformation. The war of men had become a war of systems, and in this war, whoever had the toughest engine, not the brightest general, would win. In October, when the German General Staff received the latest reports from the front, a phrase circulated among the officers: "We did not lose to Patton's tanks, we lost to their trucks." It was the epitaph of German doctrine and the harbinger of what was to follow. For while the Red Ball Express dominated the roads, the Americans were preparing something even more unthinkable, a system that would take the fuel directly to the tanks without depending on a single truck. The liberation of France was not just a military victory, it was a logistical spectacle. When the Red Ball Express convoys began to cross the roads that weeks earlier belonged to the Reich, French civilians witnessed something they had never seen: abundance. For 4 years, the country had lived under a regime of hunger and scarcity. Bread was rationed, soap a distant memory, and fuel an inaccessible rumor. German soldiers marched in worn-out boots, patched uniforms, and blank stares. Then suddenly the roads filled with American trucks, hundreds, thousands of them, carrying food, cigarettes, chocolate, gasoline, and music. Children ran after the convoys shouting "chocolate," and the drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, threw bars and packages out of the windows, as if the war had become a carnival of metal and smoke. For the population living on the edge of misery, this was not just liberation, it was a revelation. The American war had sound, smell, and taste. The sound of engines, the smell of gasoline, the sweet taste of chocolate, these were tangible signs of a world that was once again possible. The Red Ball Express, unintentionally, became a living advertisement. Where the Germans imposed austerity and fear, the Americans offered excess and hope. The contrast was brutal. The occupying troops of the Reich had preached discipline and order. American trains showed the power of improvisation and generosity. The French saw soldiers smiling, stopping to repair bicycles, sharing cigarettes and exchanging words in rudimentary French. It was the opposite of German arrogance, and more importantly, it was irresistible. The French historian Jean-Pierre Azéma described this moment as the second liberation, not just of the troops, but of misery. In cities such as Le Mans and Chartres, the trains became impromptu parades. Women waved from windows, peasants left food on the sides of the roads, and drivers responded with canned goods, soap, and groceries. The abundance was contagious. American power was no longer just military, it became moral. The Reich had promised order. The United States offered abundance, and in modern warfare abundance was more convincing than fear. As the trucks poured supplies at a factory pace, the local population began to understand the scale of the difference between the powers. A French soldier of the resistance wrote in his diary, "They do not advance as an army, but as a civilization on wheels." Every truck was a showcase of America: canned goods, portable radios, new tires, clean uniforms, music billowing from speakers. The message was clear: wherever Americans went, life returned. The Red Ball Express had become the visible line between the old world and the new. For civilians, it was impossible not to compare. The Germans had occupied France with boots and starvation. The Americans reconquered it with gasoline and generosity. Within weeks, public perception became a weapon of war. Children who once feared soldiers now followed them along the roads. Women who had hidden food from the occupiers now offered bread and wine to the liberators. And the strongest symbol of this transformation was black drivers. For the French, seeing dark-skinned men in American uniforms driving trucks and being treated with respect was a social paradigm shift. The racism that permeated both Europe and the United States was there, temporarily suspended by the force of the deed. A French peasant wrote in a letter, "They brought gasoline but also humanity." This image of diversity and strength became, without planning, one of the most powerful weapons of Allied propaganda. French roads had become stages of democracy in motion. The contrast with the Germans could not be more evident. The Reich army passed by with silence, rigidity, and scarcity. The American with noise, improvisation, and abundance. The trucks of the Red Ball Express were, at the same time, warehouses and flags, and each delivery was also a demonstration of cultural power. The Reich had promised 1,000 years of order. Americans showed 100 days of plenty. The Germans controlled by absence. The Americans conquered by their presence. Even Allied commanders noticed the effect. General Eisenhower reported in a letter, "The Red Ball Express is more than logistics. It is a symbol of victory that the French people can touch." And he was right. Where the Reich tried to command respect by force, the Americans won it over by generosity. The power of a can of soup, a piece of soap, a box of cigarettes, banal things in America, but miracles in France in 1944, was worth more than any speech. And while the French watched endless trucks cross the roads, the Germans watched something more terrifying, the transformation of war into a public spectacle. The enemy's morale was beginning to crumble not only at the front, but in the liberated cities. Every child smiling next to an American truck was a blow to Nazi propaganda. Each village supplied was a psychological victory. Abundance had become a weapon, and she killed with subtlety, without gunshots, but with comparisons. For the retreating German soldier, the sound of American engines already meant defeat. For the French civilian, it meant rebirth. The war was being won not only on the roads, but in the hearts. And by the time the trains reached the Belgian border, the message was already engraved in every liberated village. The future spoke English, smelled of gasoline, and tasted like chocolate. But the true impact of the Red Ball Express was yet to come. For when winter set in and the terrain turned to mud, the war tested the limits of this continuous motion machine, and it was there, between the ice and scarcity, that the Americans proved what it meant to really master logistics. When Patton's tanks began to slow down in early September 1944, German generals believed, for a brief moment, that the prediction was finally fulfilled. The Third Army had advanced more than 400 miles from Normandy, a feat that defied military logic itself, and now apparently the fuel had run out. Sherman tanks lay motionless in the soggy fields of France, their crews waiting for orders that didn't come. But what the Germans didn't know was that the pause wasn't a collapse. It was a short breath in the midst of an unprecedented industrial race. Hours later, the metallic silence was broken by the distant roar of hundreds of engines. They weren't tanks, they were trucks. The Red Ball Express had become the real driving force of the offensive. While the armored columns waited for fuel, the convoys moved on, crossing the destroyed roads with speed and almost mechanical obstinacy. For the first time in the history of modern warfare, the rear set the pace of the vanguard. The front lines were no longer advancing by the power of the tanks, but by the ability of the trucks to feed them. An American sergeant described the scene as hungry tanks waiting for the sound of the Red Ball. It was more than a metaphor. It was the very structure of the war being reversed. Patton's blitz was no longer driven by maneuver, but by maintenance. Each mile won depended on how accurately the convoys delivered fuel, ammunition, and food. Without them, the army stopped. With them, the impossible became routine again. Military historian Martin Blumenson described the phenomenon as the symbolic transfer of firepower to delivery power. What the Germans called the rear guard, the Americans called the silent vanguard. It was a new kind of weapon, not of destruction, but of continuity. Modern warfare came to be defined not by the force that attacks, but by the force that sustains the attack, and the Red Ball Express underpinned everything. During the most intense weeks, the trucks transported more than 12,500 tons of supplies per day, equivalent to the entire weight of a full armored division. Patton's divisions, which had previously calculated their offensives in fuel hours, now planned according to the pace of the convoys. When a truck was delayed, a battle awaited. When a train arrived, a city fell. The axis of the war had shifted. The six-cylinder engine of a GMC truck now decided the fate of operations. The Germans, accustomed to seeing power in the 88mm gun, were perplexed by a new form of force. A Wehrmacht officer captured in September summed up his confusion. The Americans don't fight with weapons, they fight with movement. And he was right. The Red Ball Express had turned the movement into doctrine. Patton, the general of the relentless advance, had become dependent on anonymous drivers who drove trucks on muddy roads. The glory of war was decentralized. The rear was no longer invisible. Power changed places. Logistics, previously considered servile, became sovereign. While the German generals discussed the best position for their panzer divisions, the Americans discussed the fastest route for their convoys. The difference wasn't just strategic, it was civilizational. The Reich still saw war as a duel of heroes. The United States saw it as a systems operation. The Red Ball Express represented the triumph of the machine over the myth. Every truck that left Cherbourg carried more than fuel. It carried the very concept of modern power. Patton grasped this faster than anyone. In his diary, he wrote, "Our trucks are our continuous artillery. They don't shoot, but they make every shot possible." It was the confirmation of a new military hierarchy. The tank could be the symbol, but the truck was the sustenance. And when the front stopped, it was the truckers, not the generals, who restored the movement. On certain days, the Red Ball columns operated under direct fire, delivering fuel as bullets passed over the road. They were not combatants, but they were always in the line of fire. The war had industrialized to the human limit. The Americans didn't just fight farther. They fought more efficiently, faster, and with more resources than the enemy could conceive. When the Red Ball Express outpaced itself and began delivering supplies before the units requested it, the German General Staff realized the absurdity of the situation. They were fighting an army that not only moved faster, but that self-supplied in real time. The German enemy had become a spectator of a war that he no longer understood. General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, would confess years later, "They perfected what we invented. We created the movement. They created maintenance." It was the realization that German technical superiority had been swallowed up by American systemic superiority. The Reich prided itself on the accuracy of its Tiger tanks, but the tanks could not fight without fuel. Americans were proud of their trucks, and those trucks made sure the tanks never stopped. The power had changed form. Strength was no longer measured by the caliber of the weapon, but by the constancy of supply. The rear had become the spearhead. The Red Ball Express proved that in an industrial war, victory belongs not to those who shoot first, but to those who can keep moving when others stop. Mechanized warfare had been rewritten in real time, and the irony was inescapable. The Germans, who invented the concept of lightning warfare, were defeated by logistics that never stopped flashing. But winter was coming, and with it the ultimate test. When the asphalt disappeared, the fuel froze, and the engines had to challenge the impossible once again. For the German army, each fallen bridge was a logistical catastrophe that required weeks of planning and hierarchical authorization to repair. For the Americans at the Red Ball Express, it was just a new obstacle in the way, and like every obstacle, it would be overcome with creativity. When the explosions left craters on French roads, American drivers didn't wait for orders. They simply went downstairs, collected rubble from destroyed buildings, and created improvised ramps. When a bridge collapsed, engineers and truck drivers worked side by side, using twisted beams and demolition planks to build temporary walkways in a matter of hours. What for the German command would be considered an act of indiscipline, for the Americans was the essence of success: individual initiative. The 1944 war was won not only by production, but by the ability to adapt the unforeseen to advantage. Red Ball Express units operated without detailed maps, without warranties, and often without direct communication with command. However, the flow never stopped. A broken-down truck wasn't a problem. It was a part to be replaced, a source of parts, a new learning point. Each mechanical failure was an opportunity for improvisation. German doctrine saw this as chaos. Americans saw it as adaptive efficiency. An American sergeant recalled years later, "If one bridge fell, we built another. If there was no fuel, we stole from destroyed tanks. If there was no road, we created one." But the train was following. That was the fundamental difference between the two worlds. Germany believed that perfection produced victory. The United States discovered that improvisation produced continuity. The irony of this story is that the solution was always in front of them, and in the hands of men who were not waiting for orders to act. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more in-depth content about the invisible gears that defined the fate of World War II. Because what was at stake was not only logistics, but the very concept of command. While the Reich relied on a centralized, rigid system, the US military operated with decentralized autonomy, a model that turned each driver into a thinking link in the war machine. The Germans called it indiscipline. Eisenhower called it trust. Each unit of the Red Ball Express had tactical freedom to decide routes, repairs, and priorities. This decentralization was the opposite of total control by the German General Staff, and it was precisely this that ensured success. When congestion paralyzed a road, Americans simply opened up a new route, sometimes cutting through fields, crossing forests, or adapting railroad lines. In less than 24 hours, an entire detour appeared where there had been destruction before. Such speed of decision was impossible within the Prussian structure. In the Reich, orders went down a bureaucratic funnel. At Red Ball, they climbed off the ground. The American mentality had turned disorder into method. The truckers weren't just operators. They were field strategists, mechanics, engineers, and momentary leaders. The Red Ball Express was a living organism, driven by the sum of thousands of small decisions that, together, defeated German perfection. In logistical terms, this represented a revolution. A system that should have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity thrived precisely because it had no fixed center. When one part failed, another took over the role. General Charles Thrasher described this philosophy in a phrase that would become a motto: "We do not correct faults, we circumvent faults." It was the antithesis of traditional military thinking and, paradoxically, its greatest weapon. Each driver on the Red Ball Express was a microcosm of American culture, independent, improvising, confident. While the German soldier waited for written orders, the American one came up with solutions. When the Germans tried to replicate the system during the Battle of the Bulge, they failed miserably. Their supply convoys were stuck on congested roads, unable to operate without centralized instructions. American improvisation was inimitable because it was born of the national mentality itself, the culture of abundance and the belief that every problem has a practical solution. In the post-war archives, a German engineer wrote, "They don't follow the manual, they write the manual while driving." This phrase epitomizes the essence of the Red Ball Express, an army of truckers who invented modern warfare while waging it. Every improvised detour, every cannibalized truck, every bridge made of scrap metal was a reminder that American victory depended not only on resources, but on the freedom to use them without fear of making mistakes. This mental elasticity, so opposed to German rigidity, became the model of post-war military logistics. The concept of coordinated decentralized action, now central to modern doctrines, was born on the roads of France in 1944. And while the Germans were trying to understand how such a seemingly chaotic system could work, the Americans were already improving it. They created mobile maintenance divisions that moved alongside convoys, reduced the average repair time to less than 45 minutes, and implemented quick-change engine schemes that allowed trucks to be back on the road within hours. Chaos was only appearance. Underneath it, there was method. The Red Ball Express wasn't random improvisation. It was organized improvisation, an invisible discipline that flourished within freedom, and it was this philosophy that would become the greatest terror of the German command, because they could calculate everything, except the unpredictable. In November 1944, a report by Marshal Model concluded with resignation. The enemy fights like a factory. Even when it is disorganized, it still produces. But what Model didn't yet know is that this factory wouldn't stop even in the face of the European winter, the ultimate test of mechanical and human endurance. The cold was coming, and with it, the moment when engines would have to prove that they could beat even nature itself. When the last Red Ball Express train shut down its engines in November 1944, no one imagined that this sound would be the prelude to a new era. The roar of trucks had sustained Patton's blitz, liberated France, and redefined the concept of modern warfare. But his true legacy would not end with military victory. He would continue quietly in post-war America. Of the 23,000 drivers who crisscrossed Europe at 35 miles per hour, thousands returned home, carrying something no military manual predicted: industrial-scale logistics expertise. They had learned how to move the impossible, how to coordinate supply flows, how to deal with failures and delays as part of a dynamic system. Back in the United States, this mentality found a new battleground: trade. Within a few years, Red Ball Express veterans would found the nation's first major trucking companies: Yellow Freight, Roadway Express, Consolidated Freightways. Many started with the same military trucks they had driven in France, bought at surplus auctions. The road, which had once been a battlefield, now became an economic vein. The interstate highway system, the one that would cut the United States from coast to coast, was born, in part, out of this experience. General Eisenhower, who in 1944 had watched convoys move an army across Europe, would be the same president who, a decade later, would sign the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 into law, creating the network that replicated, in peacetime, the efficiency of the Red Ball. The logistical lessons of war had become the foundations of modern economics: redundancy, volume, speed, autonomy. What had been improvised under fire became industrial doctrine. The supply convoy evolved into the delivery truck. The military system has become the skeleton of global capitalism. The war unwittingly had taught America how to supply the world. General Motors, which had produced more than 500,000 GMC CCKW trucks for the war effort, redirected its capacity to civilian transport, dominating the logistics market with the same philosophy that had defeated the Reich: standardization, mass production, and simplified maintenance. The US military had taught the industry that speed is worth more than perfection. Logistics has become a cultural value. Companies like Ford, General Electric, and Sears have embraced principles learned from the Red Ball Express: continuous supply chains with interdependent flows and moving inventories. The notion of deliver before the customer asks was born on the muddy roads of France. And there was an even deeper human element: African-American drivers. Men who, in the war, had been segregated but proved to be indispensable, became pioneers in commercial transportation. They created cooperatives, founded small freight companies, and paved the way for the economic integration that civil laws would still be slow to recognize. The road has become a symbol of freedom. Every civilian truck that crossed the country in the 1950s invisibly carried the legacy of those 1944 convoys. The Red Ball Express had shown that a nation's strength lies not only in its ability to destroy, but in its ability to move, and that lesson has spread like fuel through the veins of the American economy. The door-to-door delivery system, large-scale logistics, just-in-time transportation, everything had roots in the military improvisation that the Germans called madness. The very concept of efficiency has changed. In the 19th century, efficiency was calculated by precision. In the 20th century, by speed. The Red Ball Express was the turning point of this transformation. The truck, once a simple support machine, had become the new symbol of American civilization, the emblem of a country that did not stop, that moved forward without asking permission, that exchanged the rigidity of order for the strength of movement. And while the Reich disappeared under the weight of its own discipline, the United States built out of chaos a system that would dominate the century. Decades later, executives of logistics companies would cite manuals from 1944 as inspiration for modern distribution networks. The Red Ball Express had become a metaphor, the idea that fluidity trumps rigidity, that volume trumps scarcity, that redundancy is the new refinement. It was, in essence, the industrialization of improvisation. The technical legacy extended to the infrastructure itself. American roads were designed based on patterns learned in Europe: wide ramps, regular refueling points, rest areas, and maintenance centers every 50 miles, a civilian copy of Red Ball Express stations. And, as in war, the fuel remained the blood of the system. Refineries and warehouses expanded around the new highways, forming a continuous supply complex that would make automobile culture and mass consumption possible. The war had created not only a military doctrine, but a model of society. From 1944 on, America understood that to dominate transportation was to dominate time, and he who dominates time dominates the world. The lesson the Germans learned too late, that logistics is the real strategy, became the silent principle of American empire. What began as an emergency operation planned to last 10 days became the prototype of a mobile civilization. Every delivery, every makeshift bridge, every gallon of gasoline transported has become a cultural code. The road replaced the battlefield. The sound of the Red Ball Express engines didn't just echo in France, it echoed in the future. And when German generals, decades later, studied the 1944 reports, they realized what they had missed. Not just the war, but the chance to understand what it really heralded. Because the Red Ball Express wasn't just a feat of transportation. It was the first draft of the modern world. And the next chapter of this story would show how even enemies, surrendered and humiliated, would recognize this truth with a phrase that has crossed generations. In the Allied prison camps, scattered throughout France and England. The silence of the defeated German generals was more eloquent than any speech. The military elite of the Reich, brought up in the belief of Prussian technical superiority and discipline, now spent their days recalling reports and maps that suddenly seemed to belong to another century. Modern warfare had overtaken them, and what remained was to understand how. In the interrogations conducted after the surrender, a pattern emerged. Almost all mentioned the Red Ball Express, albeit reluctantly. For them, the German defeat had not been imposed by a brilliant offensive, nor by a secret weapon. It had been sealed by something as prosaic as drivers and trucks. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reportedly told his interrogators, "We were not defeated by generals but by production managers. We fight against an assembly line." General Heinz Guderian, father of the Blitzkrieg, made an even more bitter confession. "They understood what we never got, that fuel beats steel." These phrases, coldly recorded in the American intelligence files, symbolize the intellectual disintegration of a doctrine. Germany, which had created the concept of mobile warfare, had been crushed by those who industrialized it. Teutonic pride, which saw in calculation and precision the essence of victory, discovered too late that improvisation and excess were more lethal than any mathematical perfection. How do you defeat an enemy who has more trucks than soldiers? This question, asked by a Wehrmacht colonel in September 1945, sums up the collective astonishment of a generation. American logistical superiority had become a form of fatalism. It was not just a matter of losing the war, but of losing faith in military logic itself. A prisoner report compiled by the U.S. Army quotes a phrase repeated by several officers: "They fight with factories, not with armies." To Americans, that phrase was an unwitting compliment. For the Germans, a sentence, what the Germans called waste, burnt fuel, parts replaced, abandoned vehicles, was, in fact, the secret of American invincibility, the belief that efficiency is not about conserving, but about continuing. While the Reich tried to preserve its resources, the United States multiplied them. Each destroyed truck was replaced before the enemy noticed. Each mechanical failure became a learning experience. Each driver killed was replaced within hours. The Germans realized that they had fought an enemy that turned loss into progress. Field Marshal Walter Model, in a rare moment of introspection before his death, wrote, "We were the last generation to believe that discipline could beat volume." This phrase echoed among the captive officers as an epitaph of the old European war. The Blitzkrieg, which in 1939 represented the pinnacle of modernity, by 1944 was already an anachronism, a museum piece in front of the American industrial machine. When interrogators showed captured officers the numbers of the Red Ball Express, 4 or 12,000 tons delivered in 82 days, 23,000 drivers, 6,000 trucks running 24 hours. Some laughed, believing it to be propaganda. Others, more lucid, understood the irony. One of them, General Hasso von Manteuffel, former commander of the Panzer divisions, declared, "If these figures are true, then we never had a chance." And they were true. The Red Ball Express had achieved what German military science considered impossible, sustaining a mechanized advance for months without interruption, without a railway line, without fixed depots, and under constant fire. The enemy that Guderian believed doomed to paralysis had turned the road itself into a factory. A British intelligence document, dated June 1945, records a remark by a surrendered German colonel: "They do not hide their mistakes, they mass-produce them." This phrase, loaded with sarcasm and admiration, captured the heart of the German defeat. The American system did not fear failure, he embodied it. It was a culture of permanent experimentation, something incomprehensible to Germanic perfectionism. The Reich had built a war machine that required everything to work. The United States had created one that worked even when everything went wrong. The result was devastating. Every German attempt to re-establish the line of defense was run over not by tanks but by trucks. The sound that preceded defeat was no longer the roar of armored engines, but the constant roar of 2-ton GMCs. The noise of the trains has become a symbol of impotence. German troops captured in Belgium confessed that they could hear American trucks at night crossing the hills, a sound that mixed with despair. For them, the Red Ball Express was not just a supply system. It was a living metaphor for the enemy, endless, self-sufficient, tireless. The German soldier fought with counted ammunition, the American with unlimited fuel. With each shot, with each retreat, the difference became more unbearable. One captive general summed it up: We waged war with the mind. They did it with engines. This reversal destroyed the self-esteem of the German General Staff. After centuries of believing in the superiority of European military intellect, they found themselves defeated by truck drivers and mechanics. The humiliation was philosophical. Clausewitz's ideal had died on the muddy roads of France. The Red Ball Express didn't just beat Germany, it ended an era of military thinking. In the testimonies, this awareness emerged in a tone of resignation. The war we planned no longer existed, said General Friedrich Schulz. They were fighting in another dimension, that of production. For the American officers conducting the interrogations, this realization was the ultimate victory. The Germans had finally understood that the battlefield was not in the trenches, but in the supply lines. The US military had turned the act of delivering supplies into a strategic weapon. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate symbol of an industrial war in which quantity had become quality. And it was at this point that the Germans themselves admitted the inevitable. The war had become mathematical, and they were on the wrong side of the equation. In the following months, these confessions multiplied, being compiled into reports that circulated among American military universities. The Red Ball Express began to be studied not as a curiosity, but as a doctrine. The phrase most often repeated by those defeated officers, "We were not defeated by men, but by machines," would be quoted by generations of strategists. But the final irony was yet to come. In 1946, when the United States invited German engineers and generals to study the Allied logistics system, many accepted. Among them were men who had laughed at the idea of a truck-powered army, and they would now be the first to teach the new American doctrine of mechanized warfare. Because fate has a sense of irony, and the next part will show how the defeated themselves helped consolidate the logistical empire that had destroyed them. On the night roads of France, where headlights were forbidden and silence could mean survival, American victory was sustained by anonymous men. They were not generals, nor pilots or poster heroes. They were drivers, soldiers who, behind the wheel of heavy trucks, guided columns of steel and fuel through storms, ambushes, and mud. The Red Ball Express was more than a system. It was a human test of endurance. Some of these men drove for 48, 60, even 72 hours without rest. One of them, Sergeant Luther Thompson, completed 1,800 kilometers in 5 days, sleeping standing up, leaning against the heated hood of the truck. Another, Private Henry Gaskins, was hit by shrapnel during a German ambush, but kept the vehicle moving to the supply line, his bloodied arm stuck to the steering wheel. Stories like these never made it into the newspapers, but they were what kept Patton moving forward. When the tank stopped, it was these men, exhausted, covered in grease and smoke, who made sure the front didn't die. One of them, interviewed years later, said simply, "We didn't shoot, but without us no one would shoot." It was the essence of invisible war. In an army that still segregated its soldiers, the Red Ball Express was one of the few places where merit was worth more than skin color. Of the 23,000 drivers, about 75% were African American, men who fought 2 wars, one against the enemy and the other against prejudice, and yet drove with ruthless discipline. Many had no weapons, they only had the steering wheel. The roads were his trench. They drove under bombardment, dodging craters and mines, guided only by the position lights painted on the sides. The fatigue was so extreme that some trucks circulated with 2 drivers changing the steering wheel in motion. The motto was simple: keep them rolling, keep them running. Nothing could stop the flow. A 1944 report recorded that in a single day, 148 drivers fell asleep at the wheel. 10 died, but the trains did not stop. Each truck was a vital link, each surrender an act of faith. When the fuel ran out, they burned alcohol or vegetable oil. When tires exploded, they improvised with rubber tapes and canvas strips. When the axles broke, they dismantled damaged vehicles and rebuilt others with cannibalized parts. The war there was made of inventiveness, not glory. Amid the chaos, mechanic James Porter was known for changing entire engines in less than 2 hours, working under bombardment. He said, "It's not courage, it's routine." And perhaps that was the real difference between heroism and duty. These men were not looking for medals. They tried to keep pace. The supply line was a race against time, and every minute lost meant missing fuel at the front, wounded without attendants, divisions stalled. Modern warfare was not won at the sight of the rifle, but at the stopwatch of the truck, and each of these drivers knew it. Captain Charles Thrasher, responsible for coordinating hundreds of convoys, described them as the most disciplined and forgotten force of the entire campaign. He said that in the early hours of August, he saw lights moving like a glowing river through the fields. Those lights were victory moving, he said. For the soldiers waiting on the front lines, the distant sound of the engines meant hope. The roar of the Red Ball was the announcement that the war was still breathing. There was something deeply symbolic about those columns of trucks, each carrying 10 tons of ammunition, food, fuel, and faith. They did not march in silence like the German troops, roared with the noise of civilization on the march. It was the sound of an entire country advancing behind them. The Germans, accustomed to the precision of panzer columns, viewed this organized chaos with incredulity. A report captured in September called American Convoys metallic ants, incessant and unpredictable, but each ant carried more weight than the German army could bear. An anonymous driver wrote in his diary, "Driving is simple, it's hard to stop." That phrase, later engraved on the Red Ball Express memorial, sums up the spirit of that operation, a war of persistence. When the roads were overrun with mud and snow, and the trucks began to skid, the drivers would get off and push, using their own clothes as traction. Some froze to death next to their vehicles, still standing, trying to move the load. No manual prepared for that. No plan foresaw the obstinacy of these men. They didn't win medals, but they carried the weight of victory on their backs. Without them, the Third Army would have halted west of Metz. Without them, France would have been reconquered more slowly. Without them, the American advance would have been a theory, not a march. And perhaps that's the most human part of the whole story, the fact that the greatest war machine in history was moved not by generals, but by calloused hands, covered in oil and dust. On every road in France, freedom arrived by driving a truck, and when the war ended, these men returned home without parades or songs. Many have been forgotten, but the roar of their engines still echoes on every paved road in the free world, because it is they who have proved in practice that modern warfare belongs to those who maintain the movement, not to those who command it. And in the next part, the story will reveal how this movement, this human instinct to move forward, transformed the post-war period and shaped the American empire that would emerge from the ashes. In the end, when the silence of defeat covered Europe, what was left of the German war machine was not an army. It was an idea that had been vanquished. The belief that precision could trump volume, that discipline would trump abundance, had dissolved on the roads of France. German doctrine, shaped by scarcity and the belief in calculation, collapsed before an enemy it was not afraid to waste. The Americans threw away trucks that the Germans would spend weeks trying to repair. They used fuel to transport fuel. They replaced what was good just so as not to stop the flow. Efficiency had been rewritten. What for the Reich was irrational, for America was strategy. Waste, planned and constant, had become a weapon. Each truck abandoned in the mud was the symbol of a logic that the enemy would never understand, the logic of excess. When the columns of the Red Ball Express finally ceased, the ground of Europe was covered with traces of industrial triumph, burnt tires, blown engines, empty cans, remnants of a war won not by scarcity, but by abundance. The Reich had exhausted itself trying to be perfect. The United States won by not being afraid to be redundant. It was the ultimate ideological collapse. Prussian intelligence defeated by mechanical brutality, the doctrine of efficiency drowned in the tide of mass production. The war ended, but the lesson remained. In the modern era, power does not belong to those who can serve, but to those who can waste without fear. Victory belongs to the one who can continue when the other needs to stop. The story of the Red Ball Express isn't just about trucking, it's about turning war into industry, and industry into destination. Logistics was not the backstage of victory, it was the main stage. And this is the universal lesson. Volume beats tactics, constancy beats talent, and flow beats genius. In the 20th century, those who dominated the movement dominated the world. Decades later, when reflecting on the campaign, German General Franz Halder would say bitterly, "We were defeated by trucks." In this simple sentence lies the irony of the whole war. An empire forged by science and technology has been destroyed by a conveyor belt of steel and grease, moved by workers and drivers. If you believe that military history is more than battles, that it is the search for the truth about how humanity builds and destroys its own limits, support this mission. Leave the like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And tell us in the comments, what is the most shocking fact about this operation? the volume of fuel, the scale of the trains, or the fact that the war was won by men who didn't appear in the victory photos, don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Because in the end, everything that moves the world to Pan and all the wars it fights begins and ends in the same truth. Logistics determine strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.